To this lecture for CVSP 203. I'm David Currell of the Department of English here at AUB, where it is my privilege every semester to teach Shakespeare and once per semester to take time out of mere English business to talk about Shakespeare in the context of civilization with a lecture entitled Hamlet, Shakespeare and His Reception. I'll mainly be talking about Shakespeare through the text that you've all read and or watched in preparation for this week's classes, Hamlet. I'll talk a little bit about reception, although most of that will be at the end, and most of that will be in the form of pictures. Here are the topics that I intend to cover, and you can see that there's a sort of division here which uses one of the nice rhyming reference points that we in the Shakespeare trade rely on: stage and page. These are the two modes in which you can come to encounter Shakespeare. His original context, up treading the boards, speaking aloud in front of a live audience, but also reading, reflecting, encountering Shakespeare as text. Again, more of the emphasis, I think, in this lecture will be on the stage, Shakespeare in the context of the theatre. But we'll talk a little bit about the page towards the end. And look, no matter what lens we choose to look through, hearing, being alert to, being sensitised to Shakespeare's words, Shakespeare's language is the only way in. What we will be getting into are two main topics. I could easily fill 100 slides with bullet points like this, topics in intellectual history that we could unfold from Hamlet and the works of Shakespeare. But just for the purposes of not keeping you here too long, I will focus on two. One is the representation of playing itself, primarily with the sense of acting in the theatre, but perhaps with a wider sense as well, playing within the dramatic space of Shakespeare's play, Hamlet. And I'll also talk about the key term, interiority. Since this is a CVSP course, and you've been reading a number of works from a number of different branches of intellectual history, one of the things that you are now getting attuned to doing, maybe expert in doing, is finding intellectual themes that connect across all of these works through time and that have something to do with the biggest general rubric that you're thinking about, modernity and the transition to modernity. One such theme, and a theme that emerges in a really complex and interesting way from the play Hamlet, is the idea of the human subject as a being with an interior space, with a cognitive life that the subject has a new modern kind of relationship to. So Hamlet's going to be an exhibit in that intellectual story, as well as an example of wonderful entertainment that was first brought to life in spaces that looked, well, that looked something like this. This little illustration looks totally serviceable if you look at it on a mobile telephone screen, and then you project it up in Batiste and it looks blurry and kind of hopeless. Don't worry, most of these blurry bits are Latin words that are labelling bits of this architectural diagram. The main thing to get is the outlines. And the reason I've chosen to put this image up on a slide is because it's the earliest, the best, in some senses it's a unique pictorial record of the theatre architecture of Shakespeare's own time. This is not actually the principal theatre for which Shakespeare wrote plays. The most famous theatre with which he is associated is, of course, the Globe. This is a theatre called the Swan, which a Dutch visitor to England who wanted to take in the local delights went and made this very, very useful and, as I've stressed, historically important sketch, because it gives us an idea of the space in which plays like Hamlet came to life. Do you go to the theatre for entertainment? Who's been to a theatre to watch a play in the current year, 2018? A fair number, probably well under half though, I would say. If you went to a theatre, probably, I'm guessing, if anybody has any interesting exceptions to this generalisation, just keep your hand up and tell me what it was like. Probably the space you went to was not entirely unlike this room. It was different? You didn't realise it was going to happen. I'm extremely sorry. I didn't prepare you. Tell us about your theatre experience.
It was nice. I watched The Lion King in London, and I watched Queen in London, and it was a different experience. It wasn't like in Beirut. It's a normal stage. It's a rotating stage with a lot of equipment. There's a higher level and a lower level.
A rotating stage, does that mean that there was seating all around the central?
One of them had a rotating stage, and the other one, the stage itself kept rotating while the play moved on.
So, please, Peter.
We were hoping this space. We were hoping this space would be much more of a theatre, you see, but then it's an auditorium. But this is West Hall stage. This has a history behind it before this miserable auditorium was created, against our will. So when you get lots of money, okay, please give us a theatre, a proper theatre. And thank you, David, that you are making that clear.
Not at all, Peter. It wouldn't be an occasion at AUB if there wasn't an appeal for donations as part of it. But also, if there wasn't a reference to the real history of these spaces and the different kinds of possibility for art and for learning that are created by different kinds of space. This, as Peter just stressed, is an auditorium space. Now, what kind of relation is there between me up here with this arch, this sort of implicit barrier separation? I'm 4 feet off the ground. I have to make myself breathless and make everybody embarrassed in order to get this kind of interaction happening. It's a space that is conducive to listening to a lecture. You're all pretty safely ensconced in a comfortable seat, which in a way, with its little armrests, creates its own little space. You can balance a phone on your knees if you want to, mentally check out. And there's not much I can do about that except threaten to put a microphone in your face. But theatres can be designed differently. If you're operating a highly capitalised theatre with a massive budget that can bring guaranteed blockbusters like The Lion King to a huge audience like in London, then you can start to get really creative with the kind of stage technology that you build, and you can build a round rotating stage that creates all sorts of opportunities for artistic spectacle. This theatre was also in London, and it also used the idea of closer contact with the audience and of mixing the spaces of spectatorship and performance in a much better way than the rebuilt Batiche auditorium is able to do. You can see here, this rectilinear, and because this is a kind of architectural diagram, we have this correct perspective and foreshortening. But you see here a thrust stage, a stage that is built well out into the circular space of spectatorship. The seating area runs around, so that depending on where you are in this large structure, you'll get a different view. And if you revisit the Swan Theatre the next time you have an opportunity, you can sit somewhere else and have a different perspective on that stage. Although human figures aren't shown in this diagram, one of the most important areas from which you can watch the play and have a connection to the performers is right up against the stage itself, in this standing room. That was, in fact, the most popular, the most common place where people would watch a Shakespearean play from. Admittance was 1 penny, the cheapest ticket. If you wanted a seat in the wooden structure that surrounded it, you'd pay twice as much. If you wanted to sit in that structure at the very back of the stage, above where those 2 stage doors are, and where you can see some extremely blurry human figures among the pillars, you could sit there right above the actors with a bird's eye view, but it would cost you 6 pretty pennies. So only the real knobs could sit up there. Those were the A-grade tickets. Yes.
Oh, okay. Do I have to use this? Okay. Okay, but in these types of stages, I think, like how I remember about theaters, that the actors, they should not give their back to the audience, but in this type of stages, they do. So does that has any relationship between this and the money, like you have to pay? Like if they give you their back, you have to pay less?
Superb question. The answer is expectations for performance change through time. Yes, it would be a cardinal sin today, partly because of courtesy and professional protocols, partly because of acoustics. If I don't have a mic and I'm standing behind this proscenium arch, and I look away, you can't hear a thing. You can't hear a thing if I do that. So it's just unprofessional to operate in that way. Clearly, and you can just deduce this from the architecture itself. That's not a convention or a protocol that has taken off yet here. At the same time, if you go to the theatre and you only see the actors' backs, you're not really getting your money's worth, are you? So that implies that these actors are probably going to be thinking about making sure that they do something a little bit that I'm forgetting about. They have to make sure they address both sides of the stage. They have to make sure that everybody is getting a little piece of their beautiful faces from time to time. The point about the people, the knobs up here in the shilling seats, is an interesting one. Because in some sense, I agree with the implication of your question. That's the worst place to watch these people, because they're going to be looking forward from the stage. They're only going to be turning around and going towards the back when they're making an exit through one of those doors. So what's going on there? And the answer that most theatre historians have come up with to account for this is that it's not really about enjoying the performance at all, or at least not in the sense of being a simple spectator. It's about being part of the performance. It's about being seen yourself. Ooh, it's the Baron such and such, and is that his wife or is that not his wife who's sitting up there with him? Well, very, very Lebanese is the comment here. Perhaps so. Yes, exactly. If you've got a seat in the front row, you make sure that all of the plebs have sat down first, so that you can swan in and show off your nice new suit before you take your own seat. Yes, absolutely. So that shows the degree to which theatre was also a social occasion. A social occasion that had an interesting relationship to the class structure of society at the time. It reproduced it in a sense by having all of these different, levels of seating and ticket classes to go along with that. At the same time, as many people celebrate about this period of Elizabethan theatre, it's also a common space where everybody from all walks of life are entertained by the same actors performing from the same script. So there's an interesting, dialectic going on there about the disposition of the populace as they go and watch a Shakespearean play in performance. I very, very briefly made a comparison between the theatre of Shakespeare's time and the cinema business today. And I think that's a pretty strong analogy. It's not a throwaway comparison. I think the prominence of play acting in Shakespeare's own culture was comparable to the cinema in our contemporary media environment. I also think there's many useful connections or analogies available around how these different types of media are produced. They're collaborative enterprises. And it may be the case that the writer is not the most important of the collaborators. If you see a modern advertisement for a film, it's very unlikely that the writer's name is going to appear, unless perhaps it coincides with the director, or maybe if it's an adaptation of a celebrated book. In general, you will see actors and you will see directors. This is certainly true also of Shakespeare's age. The actors were the public celebrities. You went to see Richard Burbage as Hamlet, rather than seeing William Shakespeare's Hamlet. In a sense, the flip side of the media environment, the page, the publication of the print version of the play, that was the space in which the writer's name was starting to matter around this time. It's worth knowing when we think about Shakespeare and his reception, and the fact that Shakespeare is such a natural, representative writer in a class like this. It's the only writer's name that is still a compulsory element of the English major, for example. That this is itself a historical creation. This is not something that's already built into the age for which he was writing. In any case, another connection between, let's say, the contemporary film industry and the Elizabethan play industry is a genre system. You know, and in fact you might only have bought a ticket to go to see a movie if you know what the genre is. You're someone who likes action. You're someone who likes romantic comedy. It's Halloween, I feel like seeing a thriller, whatever. This quote from Polonius at a key point in the play Hamlet, which I'll be returning to or dwelling on for the next 10 minutes or so. This is a little slightly tongue-in-cheek encapsulation of the genre system that Shakespeare was working in. What's he doing at this point? He's welcoming the troupe of actors who arrive at Elsinore, at the castle, by chance, but Hamlet takes advantage of their arrival to set in train one of his plots to try and resolve the great tragic crisis which is at the centre of the story of Hamlet. Polonius sort of acts as the publicist for this group, calling them the best actors in the world. And then he lists all of the genres that they work in. Tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral. Pastoral comical, historical pastoral, tragical historical, tragical comical, historical pastoral, scene individual, or poem unlimited. Seneca cannot be too heavy, nor Plautus too light. And Seneca, the name of the Stoic philosopher and playwright of first century ancient Rome. Plautus, working a couple of centuries earlier in comedy. These are, proverbial for tragedy and comedy in turn in the classical context. And yet between Seneca tragedy at its most pure and gory, Plautus at its most playful, light-hearted, jolly, belly-laughing. You have all of these other mixed forms. And it's that space of mixture that Shakespeare operates in. It's true, particularly early in his career, he does write some sort of pure genre pieces. The Comedy of Errors. This is directly based on a text by Plautus. Just as Titus Andronicus, his goriest, most Halloween-appropriate play, that's not based precisely on any play by Seneca, but clearly is a Senecan performance, very deliberately so. But as Shakespeare experiments more, as he thinks about what his competitors are doing in other theatres, increasingly, all of his plays start to turn into tragical, comical, historical, pastoral performances. Hamlet is certainly among them. Tragedy is the dominant mode, but there's much to be amused by, or bemused by, or be confused by. This is not tragedy that is on one path where the bodies rack up, the emotions become more intense and hyperbolical, the situations become more extreme and more painful in a kind of linear way, where it all adds up to one big crescendo. I think you can argue that at the very end of Hamlet, you do get that. You get the tragic payoff. You get the body count. But the way there is through all kinds of detours and byways and indeed an exploration of that space of subjectivity and interiority that I'll get to when I finish this section about playing. My point is that one of the complications about the play Hamlet is precisely that it exhibits this knowingness about the genre system. This is not simply reproducing the formula, it's thinking about the space of formulas, the opportunities within them, Polonius might not be a very good literary critic. Polonius might not be a very good actor. You'll remember that Hamlet makes fun of Polonius having been an actor in his young days and playing Julius Caesar. And what happens to Julius Caesar? He gets stabbed. Yes, indeed, it's a nice restrained action there. And what happens to Polonius? Well, he gets stabbed as well. Now, I complimented your action as restrained. It's like, you're not getting up and swinging your arms around and pulling out a huge great blade and decapitating Polonius. No, you're using a kind of decorum and delicacy to show the gesture. And it turns out Hamlet would like this. He'd say, that's good, that's natural talent. Because just as Polonius introduces this theme of genre into the space of the plot of Hamlet, Hamlet turns out to have extremely well-developed and sophisticated thoughts about acting and about performance himself. We know he's a very performative person. He makes a big deal of his first entrance in the second scene of the play, having chosen his wardrobe very carefully. He's wearing all black. And this is actually a political challenge within the court, because the message from the court is, we've put behind mourning for the previous king, Hamlet's father. We're in a mode of celebration. We're starting new alliances. Peace between Denmark and Norway, and the beautiful flowering of love between the new king Claudius and the continuing queen Gertrude. Hamlet, he comes in mourning attire. And Claudius understands what this means. He understands the code of this performance as a political challenge. Indeed, the whole play is then going to be a kind of confrontation, but a displaced confrontation, because the space of action that is open to Hamlet as a mere prince, and a space of action that he allows himself to occupy because he is so concerned with his mental space, make this a very indirect space of confrontation, a whole bunch of cat and mouse games. When one of them, and the one that gets Hamlet most excited, is the idea that he can use acting, he can put on a play, and that this, it sounds ludicrous when you summarise it, but this is somehow going to defeat the arch-villain. What's the theory? He's going to show him a representation of his own evil acts. He's going to restage his own imagination of the murder of his father. And the guilty party, as the king, sitting in the best seat of the house, right where Nadia is going to watch this performance and be so struck by the shame of seeing their guilt performed and represented that they're going to collapse. And Claudius will confess on the spot, and the guards will all pick him up and put him in a nice cell in the dungeon of Elsinore Castle, and Hamlet will be king. And it will require no other action than that. He won't have to pull out a big sword himself, won't have to go and gather an army, won't have to harass his mother into an early grave. He can just put on a play, and that will solve all the problems in Denmark. Now, as you know, this doesn't work. How could this possibly have worked? Well, Hamlet does at least have a theory of how this could work to go along with this totally cockamamie plan. And he explains the theory to the leading actor of the visiting company. The speech is so famous and so often quoted out of context, like I'm doing to some extent, that it's sort of referred to colloquially as the speech to the player. Of course, you've seen at least a film version of Hamlet, and you can discuss how this operates in its context in a more complete and sophisticated way in your discussion sections. But let me read it to you. Hamlet says to the first player, "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it, as many of your players do, I had as lief the town crier spoke my lines. Nor do not saw the air too much with your hand thus, but use all gently, for in the very torrent, tempest, and as I may say, the whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Oh, it offends me to the soul to hear a robustious, periwig-pated fellow tear a passion to tatters, to very rags, to split the ears of the groundlings. Sidebar, the groundlings, who are they? They're the people who have the cheapest tickets and have to stand in front of the stage on the ground, who for the most part are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. Well, there's a little bit of class prejudice from Hamlet. He's the sort of person who sits in the boxes for the nobility, and he doesn't think too much of the taste or literary judgment of the groundlings down there. I would have such a fellow, such a bad actor, such an over-actor, whipped for doing termagant, it out Herod's Herod, pray you avoid it. So these are two famously cliche roles that suit this kind of ham acting, overacting, full of stereotyped gesture and shouting and rant. That's not what Hamlet wants. And the first player listens to this cascade of instructions and, as a court employee, says, "Yes, sir." Hamlet continues, "Be not too tame neither, but let your own discretion be your tutor, suit the action to the word to the action, with this special observance, that you o'erstep not the modesty of nature. For anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, departs from the purpose of playing, and that purpose is, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is," he's laying down a literary law of all time, "to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image and the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure. Now, this overdone or cantarioff that would make the unskilful laugh cannot but make the judicious grieve, the censure of which must in your allowance o'erweigh a whole theatre of others. So he ends the second half of this speech on the same note of saying, you should value the approval and the applause of one discerning person over a whole theatre of, the masses who go and, pay our wages with their tickets. Possibly this is a speech that Shakespeare is aware might draw a few hoots from the groundlings. If you're a groundling and the protagonist of my play insults your ability to understand what's going on and says, you're a crass person who only laughs at the stupidest slapstick, maybe that's inviting a little bit of byplay. In any case, in the middle of this slide, you have the theory of mimesis that Hamlet puts in these memorable phrases which are sometimes attributed to Shakespeare as if this was just transparently his own theory of aesthetics, that theatre is supposed to be directly representational, holds the mirror up to nature. But it's a strange fairy tale magic mirror because it has this extra level of moral efficacy. It shows virtue her own image. Good people recognise what is good in the behaviour of actors who may be fairly shady characters impersonating good people in made-up plots. You would expect virtue to be paired with the word vice. That would be the obvious flip side of the coin. Hamlet's mind and Shakespeare's poetic technique exhibits a habit of sort of always jumping one step further. So instead of the word vice, we get the word scorn. So the moral attitude that is applied to vice comes to stand for the opposite of virtue, scorn her own image. And this is, of course, what he wants to happen. The villain whom he scorns, whom he condemns, whom he wants to see in hell, Claudius, his father-in-law, he wants him to see his image and despair. Despair and confess. But it doesn't work. Is theatre not powerful? Is this not an art form that can work any social good? It would be a rather unhappy thing for somebody so attached to performance as Hamlet to experience. Again, that word scorn that I highlighted a second ago, that could be a little bit of a clue here to why this play turns out to be a tragedy. There's another point in the play where the word scorn appears, in the most famous of the soliloquies, to be or not to be. Who would bear the whips and scorns of time? And after that line, Hamlet lists a whole bunch of other unpleasant, unendurable moral outrages that human beings have to suffer in society. The proud man's contumely, the insolence of office, the law's delay. There's an important one. If there's no law, if the law is going to delay so long, if the time is out of joint so that the delay never ends, what are you to do if you're on the side of good, if you're on the side of justice? And if your attempt to trick villains into confessing by putting on a play for them doesn't work. Well, that is the dramatic situation that Hamlet grapples with. But what I just described when I was standing on the other side of the podium didn't really sound like a dramatic situation, it sounded like a moral quandary. And this is perhaps what's special, or perhaps what is the feature that causes Hamlet to have the reception that it does through the early modern period that you're thinking through in this course. The fact that a moral quandary carries the dramatic weight. And where does a moral quandary occur? In the mind of the subject. And so we move to Hamlet's interiority. Here's just a quick grab bag of quotes that show Hamlet constantly meditating on his own powers of meditation. As he says to his mother, "I have that within which passes show." Respect my interiority. He says it later on to his friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, "I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams." And here the fact that his thoughts tend to pessimism, that he meditates on his own impotence, is uppermost in his mind. Perhaps also the theme from the famous "To be or not to be" speech, the wish for annihilation or self-annihilation, but a wish that he can't commit to because there's always another thought past the present thought, and there it's the thought of damnation, a damnation that he actually wishes upon his enemy. Itself a rather morally dubious position to be in. But that undiscovered country beyond the threshold of death is a space that he can't find it within him to simply commit to and become, an annihilating instrument of vengeance, which was a very popular transformation for the protagonist of an Elizabethan tragedy to make. I referred to Shakespeare's early Senecan drama, Titus Andronicus, earlier. Titus is very happy to, happy is absolutely the wrong word. This is, okay, I've slipped a little bit perhaps by not working to a script. Titus commits fully to becoming an instrument of totally destructive, murderous, horrific vengeance through the end of that play. But Hamlet wants to preserve his own moral significance, and he can't do that. And yet, the imperative laid down by his father is something he so wants to commit to. As he says, as the ghost of his father is departing, with the famous words from under the stage, "Remember me, remember thee, yea, from the table of my memory I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, all sores of books, all forms, all pressures past that youth or and observation copied there, and thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain." Thy commandment all alone. And again, in a 50-minute lecture, I can only gesture at the opportunities to make connections and interpretations on Shakespeare's choice of vocabulary and management of the language of this play. But you can almost play the game of opening Hamlet at random and seeing, okay, what on this page connects back to the "to be or not to be" speech, or to one of the other famous soliloquies. For example, the soliloquy that he gives at the end of his introductory scene, where he wishes, oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the Almighty had not fixed his cannon 'gainst self-slaughter. This is the religious scruple against suicide that I mentioned earlier, of course, based on the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." So much as he would like to hold on to the commandment that his father has laid down, Hamlet revenge, he can't give up the Decalogue because that would be jumping into a space completely outside of all moral consequence. It's tough being Hamlet, yeah. Here's the moment where, and this again is part of the dramatic construction of the play Hamlet, you have these wild scenes where the play seems to be all about theatricality, and Hamlet's own manic linguistic motor through those scenes, through Act 2, Scene 2, through to Act 3, Scene 2, is all energised by the fact that he has this, again, just totally doomed and ridiculous plan to try and induce confession through mimesis, through putting on a play in front of the villain. That fails because, it fails, but the failure is, I must grant, somewhat ambiguous, because Claudius does break up the performance. He calls for a light. He says, away, and he leaves. And of course, when the king leaves your performance, that's curtains. You know, there's no need to continue with the play itself. And so Hamlet is momentarily energized. Look, this created an effect. Claudius was disturbed. Perhaps my plan worked, but of course he realizes that getting up and leaving the theatre is not actually, evidence that would allow you to be convicted in a court of law. And so, how does Shakespeare pace things? We then have Hamlet come across Claudius when he's kneeling in spontaneous prayer. And this is a scene that illustrates the idea of dramatic irony, or a gap in knowledge between the characters on stage and us as audience members who know more about the situation that is being played. We know that Claudius's prayer is ineffective because at the end, he says, my thoughts fly up, my mind remains below, words without thoughts never to heaven go. This was a failed prayer. Hamlet, however, completely reversing the kind of religious scruple that I've just been underlying in his thoughts about himself and about self-slaughter, shows himself at his moral worst. This is how he thinks through the situation in real time. Now might I do it, pat. Now he's a-praying. And now I'll do it. And here we can use a very big gesture to show that he's about to slam his sword into Claudius, but freeze frame, just as the sword arm of Pyrrhus freezes above Priam in the rehearsal performance of the first player when he first arrives at Elsinore. And so he goes to heaven. And so I am revenged. That would be scanned, that would be analysed. A villain kills my father, and for that, I, his sole son, do this same villain send to heaven. Why, that is hire and salary, not revenge. He studied too much theology at university, and he decides, if I send Claudius to his grave in a state of absolution because he has confessed and asked repentance of the Almighty, then he won't go to hell. But that's what I want. I want to send his soul to hell. What sort of monster says that? But he's everyone's favourite character. Yeah, well, yes, so, revenge. Yeah. The Elizabethans thought about revenge. They thought, well, this is a moral crime. There's a whole bunch of moral crimes that people, and let's say, at least given how much he talks about conscience, will call Hamlet a person of conscience, moral crimes that people of conscience feel very strongly driven to commit. Here's the orthodox view of a philosopher, Francis Bacon, about revenge, in his very short, pungent essay. It's wild justice. But, you know, here we are in a civilization program. We have civilization. We have institutions. We have laws. Laws deal with cases of murder, not the wild anger of young men that's going to create social anarchy. But this is precisely why, you know, Hamlet's meditation on all of the wrongs that a human being has to put up with includes the law's delay. We know that the law isn't going to intervene in monarchist Denmark. Claudius has become the law. And so this leaves Hamlet completely on the fence. He wants to be a modern, somebody who learns the lessons of people like Francis Bacon and says, of course, revenge, that's barbarism. That doesn't belong to modernity. But at the same time, if there's no other recourse, justice won't be done. And not only is he full of passion because it's his own situation, but he also thinks of himself as a man of justice. He's going to be the king one day. I mean, he's thought about these kinds of political issues. Well, where will we go from here? You'll see that I've done something that tends to happen when you lecture about Hamlet. Actually, two things that tend to happen when you lecture about Hamlet. One, you go way over time and you exhaust 10% of your material and you look at your watch and you see that it's already 10 to the hour. Two, you end on a moral paradox. What's Hamlet supposed to do? Not just compelling reasons on each side, but compulsory reasons on each side. What do? You say, thank you for attending the performance. You've been a wonderful audience. I hope you enjoy the next show. Thank you very much for your attention.